Welcome to Polaris Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmiri, inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of conversations on the US China relationship and its impact on the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. My guest today is Dr. Parag Khanna, whose new book, Move, The Forces Uprooting Us, is already being described as one of the most influential books written this year. Singapore-based Parag Khanna is a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler, and best-selling author. He is founder and managing partner of Future Map, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. Author of numerous books, he is a widely cited global intellectual and provides regular commentaries for international media. I'd actually written an introduction to why this book is so important for all of us and for planet Earth. But the New York Times, in a powerful article on climate change published 2 days ago, so accurately describes what I wanted to say that I got rid of my introduction, and I'd like to quote from the New York Times. Here's what the Times said. So many of the conversations about global warming focus on the direct consequences projected far into the future. Images of fires and floods on an increasingly uninhabitable planet if the governments of the world, especially those of the US, China, and other leading greenhouse gas emitters, fail to curb the use of fossil fuels. But the truth is, again, the Times says, that we are already living in a world that is being transformed by climate change. Every single country on earth is feeling its effects today. Please welcome Dr. Parag Khanna. Good
So
morning,
nice to see
Parag
you.
Khanna. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So nice to see you, Sawa. Happy holidays.
Well, happy holidays to you too. And here you are like clockwork. Every 2 years, you bring out a blockbuster book, expand our optic. Listen, Parag Khanna, in your new book, Move, you offer a compelling look at powerful global forces that will, over the next decade, cause billions of us to move geographically, ushering in an era of radical change for humanity. Tell us a bit about the forces that you say will cause this upheaval, and you did mean billions, didn't you?
That's exactly right. If you look back historically over the past several centuries, the number of people who have become migrants, who have migrated, shifted location, relocated due to forces beyond their control or in search of opportunity has been growing so significantly that you can genuinely say that the decimal point keeps on moving to the right.
Hmm.
We had millions of people migrating in the 18th century, tens of millions in the 19th century, hundreds of millions in the 20th century. And in this century, it will surely be more than a billion people who will relocate, mostly, well, a mix of domestically and across borders. And whereas historically, to bring it to the citation you had from the Times, whereas historically, the driving forces have been economic or political, famine or civil war, genocide, economic crises. Already today in the 21st century, climate is as big a driver of migration as these other variables are. So in the 21st century, you have economics, politics, and climate as three buckets of major drivers of human dislocation and relocation, and it will surely amount to more than a billion people.
Wow. That really is something. But Parag Khanna, uh, look around us today. There are powerful nativist forces on the increase. Governments increasingly are turning nationalist with the support of their population, I might add. So you're really saying that this popular wave that seems to be encompassing us more and more is actually going to go into reverse at some point. Is that what you're saying?
I think it already is. And I think in terms of to contextualize that notion that we are in a world driven by populist, nationalist xenophobia, I think that that was only true for a limited period of time. And it was true in a limited set of places. And we often hold up Trump or Brexit or Viktor Orban or the Five-Star Movement of Italy, as being the archetypes of this phenomenon. But if you look at again to the world today, Trump is no longer president of the United States. Biden is going back to America's mass migration policies. It's easier to migrate to Britain today than it was 5 years ago because they've realized because of the acute labor shortages that they've faced in everything from healthcare to transportation and other areas, and that these two countries are not representative of the entire West anyway. Hungary certainly is not. Canada is the most generous country in the entire world on a per capita basis in terms of inward migration, 400,000 people every single year. Germany just had an election in which a center left coalition came into power, one that's pro immigration, and the country has assimilated millions of new migrants, including from the Middle East, over the last 5 or 6 years into its workforce, which has made it the only growing labor force in Europe. So we already see this brand of strategy less, strategy free populist nationalism in retreat today. And most certainly we will in the future, given the labor shortages that these economies face. These same countries that have had these populist governments are the same ones that are unelecting them today because they realize that those governments don't have an economic plan. And to have an economic plan also means to have a demographic plan to maximize your human capital, to expand your labor force, to recruit the taxpayers and caregivers of the future. So what I'm seeing around the world is not continued retreat into populist nationalism, but rather a growing pragmatism around issues of migration.
So what you're saying, Parag Khanna, is that the changes that you predict will naturally take place. These aren't decades away; they're around the corner.
Absolutely. And one of the big themes in the book is what I call the war for young talent, right? And those are the
Right.
countries that are that have already made this realization, first and foremost. If you haven't made this realization, if you are a country like Russia or Bulgaria, then you haven't realized that you are in acute demographic crisis and you have to start to recruit the next generation of residents on your soil, even if they are not from your same ethnic group, then it's a long road ahead for you, and potentially it's too late. But if you look at a country like Japan, even we tend to identify Japan as almost being the archetype of an insular, sort of civilization that is not friendly towards foreigners. But what you see in Japan is that, first of all, the fact is that there have never been as many foreigners living in Japan as there are right now. There are 3 million non-Japanese people living in Japan. Now, no one comes to Japan by accident, right? It's an island. You're there for a reason. You were allowed there. You were given a residency status. And that's precisely what's happened. And just recently, in just the last couple of weeks, they've passed some landmark legislation that is further expanding the rights of migrants to permanent residency. And they're going to be doing even more things around allowing foreigners more frictionless access to buy into the property market all over the country and to really resettle in Japan. So the future Japan certainly does not look like the past Japan. So there's many, many examples like this that actually reveal the truth of how countries are approaching this issue. And as you see in case after case after case, it's much more pragmatic and driven by supply and demand right? Supply and demand should dictate our immigration policies. It's much more driven by that than by this notion of a knee-jerk populist xenophobia, shoot from the hip, Boris Johnson style kind of government. No intelligent country wants to run themselves like that anymore. And their immigration policy is among the most strategic decisions that they can make. And they don't want to do it in the haphazard way of these countries that are flailing and facing massive labor shortages and simply hampering their own economies in the process.
Well, Japan, I'm so happy you mentioned that because not too long ago, at least the world of robotics and so on was assuming that that's where Japan is headed as it gets an older population because it is so homogeneous that it will be difficult to invite in lots and lots of people from outside. So robots are going to take care of the older people and so on. But it sounds like that paradigm is not as relevant going forward.
No, it may or may not be, but whether it's driverless cars or whether it is robotic nurses for the elderly or artificial intelligence in the classroom and displacing teachers, none of these things are happening as quickly as some people, I should say, not all people, forecasted or predicted that they would. And even if those things do happen, it doesn't mean that they are universal. But
Sure.
the fact is that right now, as we speak, they're aging Japanese, aging Americans, aging Europeans, aging Russians. I don't see an army of hundreds of millions of robots running around right now as we speak, caring for the elderly. I do see, as I document in the book, that there is a war to capture Filipino nurses, human beings
Yes.
who are eminently qualified to take care of elderly people, and that their salaries are going up from Canada to Dubai to Hong Kong to China to Germany to Japan to Australia. Everywhere in the world, every country seems to want Filipino nurses, and there aren't enough of them. So, as far as I can tell, if again supply and demand is the driving force here, you can clearly see that there is plenty of human labor to do in taking care of each other, and among many other sectors, everything from nurses to teachers to garbage collectors, the things that in the non-tradable services sector, obviously construction, building, retrofitting, the green adaptation of our infrastructure and our built environment. This is all done by humans.
Hmm.
So we don't have what we have is a lot of countries that don't pay high enough wages for these essential services to attract people within their own country to do them. But even if they did, they would still have labor shortages because they're aging societies. And even if you did have more robots doing these things, you still need a tax base, and we haven't taxed the robots. And therefore, which is actually an area of
Being proposed. Yeah.
significant debate and conversation, as you know. So there is no way around the need for more people. Literally no way around it.
So, Parag Khanna, let me remind viewers who've joined us after the program began that this is Polaris Live. I am talking today to my guest, Dr. Parag Khanna, whose book, Move, is already on the bestseller list many places around the world. And the lines are open. If you'd like to ask a question, you can shoot that to us. And we'll try and get as many of them as possible. The Parag Khanna, one of the things that really impressed me about the book, your book, is that you present facts to support your statement. So it's not just forecasting the future. Let me just read one small quotation from your book. And this is in connection with European nations. So in the book, you say, the only way for European nations to maintain their welfare states is to import new taxpayers, immigrants. Only Poland has stabilized its population mostly by attracting 200,000 Ukrainians and scrapping its income tax for young workers so that they don't leave. I was so impressed because I hadn't read that anywhere, and that's what I think makes your book doubly interesting and important because there are these facts that many of us have not before seen. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the research you did for the book?
Sure. Well, this is, in many ways cumulative in the sense that the book itself, it builds upon previous books I've written that are very much geographical in nature. So, Connectography was a previous book for which I traveled very extensively and created these maps of infrastructure networks around the world and forecast what their implications are for geopolitics and geoeconomics. And here, I wanted to write about human geography, the future distribution of the human population around the world. So as you see in the book, there are chapters on a lot of places that I've been traveling to and have returned to in recent years, whether it's Canada, Germany, the UK, Russia, Japan, and so forth, looking at these countries and really on the ground. Kazakhstan is another one. There's a whole chapter just on Kazakhstan as a climate oasis, a place that has become a magnet for foreigners. And I'll tell you, Saba, it's actually hard to just read journalistically some of these facts. You actually go and you discover them, you notice them aesthetically. And if you take the example of Kazakhstan, it's a place that I've been going to for literally more than 20 years. But on my most recent trip, right before the pandemic, it struck me that there's more and more South Asian people living there. Um, Indians in particular, English teachers, dentists, cooks in restaurants. And really, I started scratching my head and saying, I'm well aware of the historical and cultural affinities, between our societies, South Asian
Right.
societies and Central Asian societies, and so you wouldn't read about this in a Western media. No Western newspaper is reporting about the demographics of Kazakhstan. So you go to Kazakhstan and you see this really dynamic change in this melting pot of a society that it's becoming, and you really get the big picture. So I started doing a much longer profile of Kazakhstan for this book than would otherwise have been the case if I hadn't gone and actually spent time and traveled there. And then the historical framing around it became yet another kind of pathway in the book that wouldn't have occurred to me. And as you may remember, I call it the reverse Mughal Empire.
Indeed.
500 years ago, the Emperor Babur and his descendants marched south, on elephants, partially, and conquered the Delhi Sultanate and built what became the Mughal Empire. And now,
Yes.
what I'm saying is, 500 years later, we're having the reverse Mughal Empire as South Asians move north into Central Asia. And that sort of those references and analogies and kind of historical sweep of big picture of what's happening with demographics and population movements, I don't think I would have arrived at, by looking at the Kazakh Times English language translation while sitting in a cubicle in Washington. So it all kind of occurred to me while being there. And the same thing has happened in Russia and Japan, and just seeing the shifting demographics. And in Germany really stands out because I've spent a good deal of time in Germany over the last 30 years and lived there a number of times. And I've witnessed the transformation of all of the major cities of Germany, and most certainly Berlin, the place that's sort of closest to my heart and where I've spent the most time. And Berlin really bucks those European trends that you mentioned in that quote, precisely because it is open to foreigners, to all comers from everywhere in the world, open to talent, thriving with young people. It has among the highest birth rates, if not the highest birth rate in all of Europe. So it's a city where you actually see young children going to kindergarten, going to school. And so it occurred to me, when you go to a place like that, that young people want to be around young people. And the way to determine the success or the failure of European societies in particular in the future, small and shrinking as they are demographically, is to look for the cities where millennials and Gen Z are moving and where they're having children. And that's where the next generation is congregating. And that is literally the difference between success and failure in the 21st century, is simply
And
this:
so I'm
is
interrupting
your
you, but
country attracting young? Mhm.
Yeah, I'm
Sure.
interrupting you, Parag, but on this point, in Germany especially,
Mhm.
don't you think that some year, or do you think that some years from now, the Germans are going to be very thankful that Chancellor Merkel let in almost 1 million immigrants, and the rest of Europe that's been opposing it to some extent will be rather envious? Do you think so?
I think that economically, they've always been envious of Germany, of course, because it is the industrious export engine of Europe. It's the most
Yes,
productive economy. It's the largest economy. It's the largest population. It's also the only country now with a growing labor force. And that is a direct result of immigration and assimilation and worker training, vocational training of migrant populations. And the fact that they just elected a center left government that remains pro migration despite having overcome or still digesting, you might say, the challenge of having let in more than 1.5 million, nearly 2 million Arab and other asylum seekers and migrants in a very short period of time in 2015, 2016, that it has successfully done all of those things while still remaining an open society. And indeed, the new government, the new coalitions immigration policy and its naturalization policy. The
right.
pathway to citizenship is becoming easier for foreigners. All of those things are an object lesson to the rest of Europe. That is a direct statement to France and to Italy and to Spain and to Sweden and others that says, "Hey, wait a minute. How come we can do it and you can't do it? We have a even more pernicious history of ethno-nationalist chauvinism. We also have had birthright citizenship laws, but here we are redefining what it means to be a German and to have an
Fascinating.
inclusive, yeah, to have an inclusive understanding, that's collectively formulated with natives and foreigners alike in a very mature discourse that I profile in this book. It's called Die Neuen Deutschen, the New Germans. And it's a very healthy conversation that has been baking in the country over the past decade plus. So the fact that even after Angela Merkel, it's not a technocratic exercise by fiat in allowing all of these foreigners to come in, but now it is the opposition party that has prevailed over her party and is carrying forward and even expanding upon that agenda. That is a lesson, quite frankly, to the entire world, literally to the entire world. Only
Sure.
Canada doesn't need to learn that lesson. Every other country besides Canada and Germany need to learn that lesson. So I think they deservedly get a lot of praise in my book when I examine their policies and the fact that politics does not have to be this static force of opposition to the other. That is as constructed as any other position.
Well, you took the next question already out on the table. I'm speaking to you from Canada, actually, and I couldn't help but notice in your book the stardom that you give Canada in thinking ahead to all of these issues you point out. So we have a couple more questions that I need to ask you before we run out of time. But I did want you to talk a little bit about Canada. What is it? I mean, to me, what is striking is the number of Asians and other immigrants who are in powerful positions in the Trudeau government and the government of Canada at all levels, actually. But what are some of the reasons that you select Canada for one of the stardom countries in your book?
That's exactly right. And I do think it's deserved. And of course, it is a phenomenon that is not simply a product of the last couple of years of decision making. As you know very well, Canada's multiculturalist ethos was formally articulated all the way back in the 1970s under the government of Pierre Trudeau, so
Yes,
Justin's father as prime minister. So the culture has been again adapting and expanding its self understanding really over the last couple of generations. And so Justin Trudeau is fortunately pushing on an open door, and he's prevailed again in the most recent election. But again, opposition parties are not anti immigrant. As you know, there's a national consensus that immigration policy is economic policy, and that's the way they conduct their business. So they're focused on not only on having a points-based system, a digitized and efficient system, creating full-time jobs, diversifying their economy, having affordable housing, maintaining access to high-quality, free public education, expanding healthcare. All of these things relate to each other in, quite frankly, a way that has democratic support, but more importantly, is professionally implemented by a very strong civil service. And if you do those things, and if I'm not mistaken, Sawar, you and I are political scientists, if I'm not mistaken, that's what's called governance. This is not supposed to be some Herculean magical endeavor. That laundry list of things I just mentioned around housing and healthcare and so forth is not something that should be on a utopian wish list for what
Indeed,
governments do.
indeed.
It's called the day-to-day reality that every citizen on earth is entitled to expect from their government. The fact that Canada is doing it makes it sadly unique, quite frankly, in the world. But again, I firmly believe that countries will learn from Canada and Germany, and quite frankly, the United States, which has had a couple of errant episodes like Trumpism. But remember that even during the Trump administration, as the US Census that was released earlier this fall made very clear, even during the Trump administration, the United States became more diverse, more Latino in particular, more mixed race, and more people identifying as mixed race. So I think that we have to remember that from a demographic standpoint, America remains a mass migration society, anywhere from 500, 600,000 to a million new migrants every single year. And from a demographic, strictly demographical standpoint, from an ethnographic and demographic standpoint, we would look back 10 or 15 years from now and we would say, Trump who? Trump who? What was his? Now, and of course, restricting migration in terms of numbers will have had a lasting impact on the labor force that we're feeling right now. But before and after, and even in the first couple of years, again, the United States does let in more numerically more migrants than almost the rest of the world combined. So a couple of years, of not sticking to that path is not necessarily devastating, provided that the US return to it. And that's exactly what the Biden administration is doing. Hence, you can again safely say Trump who, if we look back from the year 2035, 2040.
Well, listen, we could go on for a long time. We are fast running out of time, but I wanted to see if you can compress it in a minute or two and ask you, right, America and China, both of which are powerful players in your view of the future, and they're increasingly at daggers drawn. And so your book seems to imply that this position is not very tenable in view of what's about to happen, whether anybody likes it or not. So take a minute. If you find yourself alone with President Xi Jinping, and then alone for a minute or so with President Joe Biden, what would you tell them?
Well, with Xi Jinping, the answer is pretty straightforward because I've been delivering this message in China every time I travel there over the last 5, 6 years, that I've been looking at the rise of Belt and Road. Well, I've been looking at the precursors to Belt and Road and China's overseas infrastructure investments and the strategies it pursues to build influence, for a couple of decades. But what I do say in China is that this is not you are not repeating the British East India Company, right? This is a post-colonial world and a post-Cold War world. And therefore, the psychology of all of the countries that China confronts across Central Asia, Southeast Asia, West Asia, Africa, Middle East is very different. They are on high alert against, Chinese neo-mercantilism. They don't want to be colonial subjects again. They don't want to be Cold War pawns again. So even with all of the talk about fraternity and brotherhood with other nations, if it is conducting this debt trap diplomacy and not being flexible and not transferring technology and hiring local workers and so forth, if it's not giving countries a fair deal, then they will reject China. And I give them this message in person to their face because, of course, their own people are afraid to tell them this. That if they want to succeed, They need to not just buy regimes, but to actually, not only just buy regimes or build bridges. They have to take a much more sustainable, holistic kind of approach to these countries. So that's the message for China. Just quickly for the U.S., I actually, am a big believer in promoting Eurasian multipolar equilibrium. This is something that my first book was about, and I continue to believe that that is possible. And I see the collective Western response to China's rise that is really accelerating today. The Quad Initiative, the Australia, UK, US
Right.
Initiative, the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, the Connectivity Corridors Initiative, the European Global Gateway Initiative, all of those, that acronym soup, you know, of new projects that have been launched by the G7, NATO countries, EU, and so forth. All of them, Savar, were created in the last 4 years. All in the
Yes.
last 4 years. None of them existed prior to 4 years ago. All of them are a response to Belt and Road. In fact, when they call it B3W, Build Back Better World, it's of course a direct acronym as a retort, a rejoinder to Belt and Road. And this is what was articulated at the G7 meeting in Cornwall last summer. So I'm actually rather confident that the collective Western effort to dilute China's, rapid ascent and influence in these emerging societies will succeed, and that we will move closer towards this Eurasian and global multipolar equilibrium rather than a world of Chinese hegemony. And that's, of course, the best possible outcome.
Well, Parag Khanna, you've taken a PhD lesson and imparted it in a half hour. I want to thank you for being on Polaris Live. I want to tell our viewers I have read this book, and in your holiday reading, if there's one book that you should select, in my opinion, and I don't think that Dr. Parag Khanna will disagree, one book that you should select and you should read for yourself and for planet Earth and for what's about to come is Dr. Khanna's book, Move. So with that, let me thank you, Parag, for being on Polaris Live again. And as you always do every 2 to 3 years, you've given us another injection, adrenaline of what we should be expecting.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to join you, and happy holidays to you and to all of your whole audience.
Thank you so much. So, with that, we end the autumn series of Polaris Live Conversations. Polaris Live, of course, is a no commercial set of programs in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association to look at US China in context of the wider world. And we will begin again with a new season on the 25th, Tuesday, the 25th of January. May I request that those of you who've not done so should please subscribe to our YouTube channel, because there you can find the upcoming programs, you can find listings, and it really does support us. It does not cost anything. So with that, let me tell our viewers, I hope to see you back again on the 25th of January, Tuesday. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season. Happy New Year. And until then, bye.